came across a word this week and I didn't know what it meant. Thank you, Tricia. I don't know if any of you have come across this word before. Peladophobia, I would say. I gladly accept if I'm saying that wrong. Anybody know what that word means? No? Can't ride a bike? It could be, but it's not that. It actually means a fear of baldness and of bald people. There we are. Did you know there was such a fear that existed? Well, indeed there is. I came across some other phobias. Let's see how many of these we know. I'll call this one chatophobia, but that's probably said incorrectly as well. Anybody know what that means? A fear of what? Losing. Fear of losing. No, it's not a fear of losing. It's actually a fear of hairy people. So we've had our fear of bald people, and now we have our fear of hairy people. There we are. What about this one? Odontophobia. Teeth, yes. I thought some of you might think it's a dentist. Yeah, it's actually a fear of teeth. Well done, that word don't in there, giving it away. What about this one? Aerophobia. What's this one, Derek? A fear of pilots, a fear of flying. I'm sure the pilots are all very nice people. A fear of flying. And what about this one? One last one. Phobophobia. Fear of fear. Fear of fear it is. So imagine being afraid of being afraid. That's you're going to shoot yourself in the foot to begin with, aren't you? There's a lot of phobias that are out there, and even if we don't have any of these phobias, chances are we are unlikely to go through life without experiencing some level of fear. It might not go to that full extent of being a full phobia, but we are unlikely to go through all of life without facing some fear. Have I told you about the time when I was afraid? Well, there's lots of times when I've been afraid, but one time in particular when I was very, very afraid. Probably the most afraid that I have ever been. I was taken on a fairground ride by my aunt. I was only about 6 years old or so, and you can see the pictures on the screen. It was a ride which was like the big wheel. Well, that's nothing scary, you're saying to me. Yeah. But it was a big wheel that went around, and then on each spoke there was a cage. And then that cage went around as the big wheel went around. Now, bearing in mind I was only little, and once the operator had strapped me in with my aunt, I hasten to add, there we are with our little lap belt thing, sat in the chair, in the seat, and then he closed the cage door, and then as he let us move on so as he could fill the next cage, he spun us around for good measure. I mean, that did not help me, did it? Because then I spent the whole time, I can remember to this day, screaming my head off, just wanting the ride to end. But of course, eventually, 10 hours later, well, that's what it felt like anyway, the ride came to an end. I could get off, and I vowed never to go on it again. That fear could be managed by not putting myself back in that situation. But not all fears can be managed in that way, especially when they are caused by circumstances that are imposed upon us or situations that are not of our choosing. Just like the disciples in Mark 4, verse 35 onwards. They didn't choose to sail that day. Jesus told them to get in the boat. And they certainly wouldn't have willingly embraced that storm, but it came upon them and they just had to endure it. But it made them very afraid, which led them to seek Jesus in their fear. Now, we've been thinking since Christmas about people who sought Jesus for a whole host of different reasons. And in this case, the disciples sought Jesus in fear. So let's see what we can glean about coping with the fearful storms when they arise in our lives, and realise the benefit that comes when we go through those fearful storms with Jesus by our side. Now, when I lived in Dorset, We lived in an area that was called the Blackmore Vale, and my nan always used to talk about how a storm could get trapped in the valley where we lived. And indeed, I heard it myself, that sometimes when a thunderstorm came, then in fact it would rumble on, sometimes for days, I kid you not, as it would get trapped in the circle of hills and couldn't escape it. And in the exact same way, the hills that surrounded the Sea of Galilee could trap a storm and cause it to whip up the waters. It is a well-known fact that storms could suddenly arise and they could be very severe on the Sea of Galilee. Now, Mark 4:37 describes the storm on this particular day as a furious storm. I think that's a good word for any storm. And given that 4 of the 12 disciples were fishermen, experienced fishermen, for them to have this awful fear of drowning, well, then it must have been bad. And you know, on that point, genuine, awful fear can often be seen in society today as a bit of a dirty word, shall we say. When someone expresses their fear, it can be dismissed quickly as just simply someone being irrational. But to that person who is feeling afraid, it is a very real issue. And Mark 4 shows us that even the most burly, the most experienced, the most brave of people can become afraid, just as the disciples did. And so, my friends, if you find yourselves feeling a sense of awful fear coming over you for any reason, then I don't want you ever to feel that you have to pretend or hide it away. Because this is a place where we can be real and honest with each other, and a place where we can seek Jesus in our fear. A fear that might be caused by the unknown, perhaps. Or conversely, we might be afraid of the known. We don't like what we know is around the corner. We might be afraid of change that we have to face. Or maybe we're afraid of things not changing, of the status quo continuing. We can be afraid of the outcome of decisions, or afraid for the fact that we have to make a decision at all. We can be afraid of a whole host of different storms that we can find ourselves in. And in each and every one of those times of awful fear, the answer is to seek Jesus, to turn to him at the earliest opportunity that we might receive the benefit of facing that fear with him. Now, it's interesting that the disciples clearly attempted to ride out the storm and cope with their fears by themselves. Come on, lads, let's row harder. Come on, boys, we're not going to let this storm beat us. Dig in deep, keep going, grit and gumption, that's all that's needed. But actually what they needed was Jesus. And as this awful fear rose up and eventually overwhelmed them, what heartache they could have saved themselves if they had sought Jesus earlier. And how many times do we, my friends, turn to grit and gumption before we turn to Christ in our fears? We struggle on, we persevere, we keep going, we don't give in. But you know, not giving in when we turn to Jesus is not the same thing. When we turn to Jesus in our fear, it's not giving in, it's more like letting go. And there's a difference. Because it's letting go of the need to overcome that fear by ourselves or to battle that storm on our own. It's about letting Jesus journey with us. And that's what the disciples finally realize in verse 38 as they go and wake the sleeping Jesus. Verse 38. Now, don't overlook that fact as we read on, that Jesus was sleeping. Think about it. In a life-threatening storm, Jesus is sleeping. In a noisy, chaotic boat with men shouting and hollering and waves crashing and swamping over the boat, Jesus was sleeping. Now that in itself is a statement about who Jesus is. Only the Lord of creation would be unafraid when creation throws such a storm at them. And that is who Jesus is. Majesty. He is the Lord of all. He is the creator. He is the sustainer of this world. He is the King of kings. Only God could sleep through a storm like that. And don't forget, he could have woken up at any time, but he didn't. And there is a purpose in that too. You know, when I was doing my life-saving lessons in the swimming pool, I was taught that when you see someone drowning, you don't go to them straight away. I don't know what people are taught these days, but going back more years than I care to admit, that was what I was taught when I had my life-saving. Is that the word for it? It doesn't sound right in my head. A life-saving, you know, when someone's drowning, you've got to save them in the pool, or the sea, or whatever it might be. Now, the instinct will be to immediately jump to their rescue. But I was taught to wait. Wait and then swim to them. Because to go too early could actually result in them pulling you under the water. Instead, what you needed is for them to tire a little, to stop striving, and then when you get to them, they won't fight against you when you're trying to rescue them. And that is sometimes what I believe Jesus does with us. We are in the midst of that storm, and fear is overtaking us, and panic is rising up, and he waits for us to stop striving. For only then are we ready to receive his intervention. Only then will we let him do what he knows he needs to do. And the surrender is demonstrated by the fact that we seek him. And in this case, Jesus stood up, and in verse 39, he instantly calmed the storm just with the command of his voice. A demonstration, a further demonstration of the Creator's power over creation. A reminder that Jesus, the Lord, reigns. But let's go back a bit and note one other thing about this awful fear that the disciples experienced. As the storm was raging and the disciples were battling and Jesus was sleeping, the disciples overlooked something very important. They overlooked the fact that Jesus was with them. His presence alone should have brought about a peace in them, but they failed to see the benefit of simply being with Jesus. Instead, panic and that awful fear took over. And my friends, when we forget that Jesus is with us in the midst of some kind of fearful storm, we too will find that that panic and that fear will overwhelm us. There's a lovely story told about a little lad called Martin who took a trip up to his grandmother every month with his parents on the train. And one day Martin said to his parents, I'm grown up now, I want to do the trip to grandma's on my own. He wasn't grown up, but you know what it's like when children think that they're grown up. And they say, I can do that on my own. And you as parents think, no you can't. But you sort of also know that you've got to let them do it. So anyway, they agreed and they put him on the train. And as he's there in the carriage, they talked through the window and gave him some tips for the journey and what to do and all sorts. He said, I know. I've been through all of this with you 1,000 times. I'm going to be okay. And as the train was about to leave, the father whispered in his son's ear, Son, if you feel scared or insecure, open this, but don't open it unless you need to. And he slipped a bit of paper into his son's pocket. Now Martin was alone then on the train, sitting just as he had wanted, doing the trip up to grandma's, looking out at the landscape as he went past, and he was enjoying the ride until suddenly some people came in and they seemed a bit rough and they were making a lot of noise and he started to feel uneasy And then the conductor came along and made some comments about him being alone, and he shouldn't be alone on the train, and he began to feel even more uneasy, and another person looked at him with pitiful eyes and thought, oh, poor thing. And he felt even more uneasy. And so with that, he suddenly remembered what his father had said. Son, if you feel scared or insecure, open this. So he rummaged into his pocket and he pulled out this bit of paper that his father had put there. And as he read it, he read, Son, if you need me, I am in the last carriage. Back in the days when you could hop onto a train even after it started, the father had hopped into the last carriage as it went past. And my friends, Jesus is always in that metaphorical last carriage with us. You know, we are never alone. Jesus is always with us. Even if we feel alone, we're not alone. Even if we feel alone, we have to tell ourselves that we're not alone, because we're not. Jesus is with us. The King of Kings is with us. The Lord of creation is with us and by our side. And there is nothing that he can't do. No storm that he can't still. And so while we wait for his intervention, we need to let just his presence alone keep us from that awful fear overwhelming us. But ironically, and I love this honesty that we see in the Gospels, the disciples actually end up being more afraid after Christ's intervention than before. Rather than relieving their fears, Jesus actually multiplies them. But this time, instead of it being fear of a problem, they now experience fear of a person. That's what verse 41 says. They, the disciples, were terrified and they asked each other, who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. The right sort of fear as opposed to the wrong sort of fear. You see, fear doesn't have to always be a bad thing. Not if we're talking about a fearful awe of the Lord rather than an awful fear of life. For in truth, when we realise the immensity of who Jesus is and the enormity of his power, the only right response is fearful awe. I'm sure you've read at some point in your lives The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. And there's a section in there where Susan and Lucy are getting ready to meet Aslan, the lion, who of course represents Christ. And Mr. and Mrs. Beaver are talking animals. Every good child's book has to have a talking animal, doesn't it? And they're talking animals. They're preparing the girls for their encounter with Aslan the lion. And Susan says, oh, I thought he was a man. Is he quite safe? I shall feel quite nervous about meeting a lion. That you will, said Mrs. Beaver, but make no mistake, if there's anyone who can appear before Aslan without their knees knocking, they're either braver than most or else just silly. Then he isn't safe, said Lucy. Safe? Said Mr. Beaver. Don't you hear what Mrs. Beaver tells you? Who said anything about safe? Of course he isn't safe. But he's good. He's the king, I tell you. And that, my friends, that power, that majesty, that authority, that is all wrapped up in Christ the King. And the disciples saw a glimpse of his sovereignty that day in Mark 4. They'd seen it before, of course. They knew that he was the one who had authority over sickness because he made sick people well. They knew that he was the one who had authority over demons because he had set people free from demon possession. They heard he had authority to forgive sins and to teach the masses. And in time, they would also see that he had the power to feed the crowds and to raise the dead to life. And they will also soon see that Jesus had the power to walk on water. Now, if you have your Bibles open, turn over to that account. We'll find it in Matthew's version, Matthew chapter 14, 22 to 33. And we find the disciples once again encountering another storm on the same body of water. This is, however, a separate incident from the one in Mark 4. This time, Jesus isn't in the boat with them. They left him behind on the shore praying as they set off at his instruction and encountered choppy waters again. And as they rowed and tried to make progress against the wind, suddenly Jesus comes up to the boat walking on water. Can you imagine it? Can you imagine if you had been in that boat and you looked out and you saw when you can barely cope with the sea in a boat, there is someone walking towards you on the water. Now they, in verse 26, think he is a ghost, and notice what happens. They become filled with fear. But, when they realise it is the Christ, see what happens to Peter. He checks that it's Jesus, and then he is in such fearful awe of Christ, walking on the water, that he wanted to do the same. He has gone from being terrified to being awe-inspired. And the truth is, my friends, we have a choice when fear comes calling. Either we can let it grip us and let that awful fear paralyze us, or we can seek Jesus in our fear and let our fearful awe of him as the one who can walk on water inspire us to do the same. We too can get out of the boat and walk on water to Jesus. Now, of course, for each of us walking on water, that will all be different. A different miracle depending on our own personal situation. But we can all be empowered by Jesus to overcome our fear and to be inspired by him. Now, yes, we all know that Peter took his eyes off Christ and he started to drown, many a sermon on that. But what a better sermon to fixate upon, to recognise someone who overcame their fear, got out of the boat and walked to Jesus. And when he did take his eyes off Jesus, always the biggest lesson to remember from that is to keep our eyes fixed upon Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. But even if we take our eyes off Jesus and we notice the waves and that fear comes welling up again over whatever it might be, rest assured, Christ immediately rescues us. You know, without any doubt, fearful storms will hit all of our lives at different times and in different ways. Some storms will be more furious than others, as Mark put it. Some storms will cause us to fear more than others. But rather than being engulfed by an awful fear of life, my friends, let us be inspired through the fearful awe of the Lord. To seek Jesus in our fears sooner rather than later, and to know the comfort of just being in his presence in stormy seas, and to know that he is the one with the power to calm our storm and to carry us through till we reach calmer waters. Let's pray together, shall we?